Staffing needs and scheduling policies. Why is scheduling so difficult in nursing? Well, we certainly don't fit the traditional business cycle of Monday through Friday 8 to 5. Would be nice, but we don't. There's also an erratic and very unpredictable demand in healthcare, and that demand can change very rapidly and very unexpectedly. It also requires a high level of expertise, and it requires that around the clock every day of the year. There's also a lot of stress involved in nursing, and so it requires that we have a good balance of time off and time at work. And staff mix varies with the acuity, and since the acuity is very unpredictable sometimes as well, so must be our staffing mix. There's a distinct relationship between staffing and the quality of care that is able to be delivered. It's not simply the numbers of people. It's also the mix of staff, the ratios that you have, and the numbers of staff. When we talk about staffing mix, we're talking about nurses, techs, unit secretaries, all of those people in the mix. And then ratios, not only is that nurse-patient ratios, but it's RN to other staff members ratio. If you have 1 RN and 10 techs and 2 LVNs, you really don't have a very good staffing ratio. And then also the numbers of staff. You might have an all-RN staff but still not have adequate staffing. If you had 40 patients and 3 RNs, on one hand, you could say we have an all-RN staff, but you would certainly not be able to legitimately claim that you had adequate staffing on most units. What happens when nursing care hours go down? Well, the literature has consistently demonstrated that there is a link between RN hours and adverse patient outcomes. And the more we reduce the RN hours of patient care, the more we increase medication errors, the more often patients fall. Patients are very dissatisfied with their pain management, which is one of the indicators that patients use to determine whether or not they've gotten good care. And then we also see failure to rescue increases when we have fewer RNs per patient day. Any organization in their staffing policies has to address certain specific areas. They have to outline how sick time is handled. That would include how employees notify their supervisors of their plan to be absent. It also should address how long people can be absent without, like say, a doctor's note or needing to take not just sick time, but maybe some vacation time. So those policies would address that. It also should address vacations and how those are requested and taken, and how they're paid. It should also speak to the number of holidays and which holidays are paid, and if there is any kind of premium pay for working extra holidays. All of that needs to be spelled out. Call off for low census needs to be addressed in your staffing policies, how that's determined, who gets called off first or next or last. It also needs to specify how on-call pay is provided and who it's provided to, and what are the parameters of those on-call hours. A lot of on-call personnel will get double time or time and a half when they actually have to come back to the facility on a call-in, like OR or maybe the OB people. And then it also needs to address tardiness and absenteeism and what the policies are relative to staff who don't come in on time or are frequently absent, and what happens from an organizational standpoint when that becomes excessive. There's also a fiscal accountability component for staffing and scheduling, and this is primarily the nurse manager's role. However, all staff members do play a part in this. because they're the ones whose hours are being tracked. And so employees who are wasting time, overtime, coming in too early, staying over to do tasks that could have and should have been done within their shift, are abusing that and are negatively impacting the budget. Being adequately staffed should not be in conflict with being ethical in the ways that an organization and a unit provide care to patients. There shouldn't be a conflict there. It should be set up so that a nurse manager can actually have adequate staffing on her unit to provide safe, quality patient care and still be within a budget. And that requires that upper management and the financial people have a genuine sense and a realistic sense of what it costs to staff a unit on an ongoing basis and how to deal with those unexpected events when people call in, or maybe there's a rapid increase in census, or when patient acuity increases. There are strengths and limitations to decentralized and centralized staffing. And when we talk about decentralized and centralized staffing, we're not talking about how the decisions are made relative to those. We're talking about what those structures look like. In decentralized staffing, the manager is the one who takes control of the staffing for the unit. It's probably more time consuming, but it does allow for the individual staff members to get more of the time off that they want, the specific days off that they want, because the manager understands what's going on in the unit, she knows the people, and she can be very creative with how those individual hours are moved around. In centralized staffing, this is when a centralized office does all the staffing for the entire hospital, or maybe they do all of women's services or all of the critical care areas. And it does represent a better usage of the manpower of the organization in meeting those needs. It's more cost effective. It also frees up the manager from having to do that, but it is far less individualized because employees are not then the individuals on your unit. They are just people's names that have to go in various slots. So it's not always considered the ideal by staff members, but it is more impersonal, and it does allow for a greater ability to be fair and equal. There are a variety of staffing and scheduling options that are available in healthcare. There's 10-hour shifts, 12 hours. Still, some facilities offer 8-hour shifts, especially for older nurses who just aren't up to working those 10 or 12-hour shifts. Sometimes when you have shifts overlapping, such as with a 10-hour shift, it can actually, if it's not done well, can actually promote time wasting by staff. If one group is coming on 2 hours early instead of going to work, they tend to do a lot of socializing and time wasting, and so if it's not carefully monitored, it can actually be a waste. Providing premium pay for weekend work, otherwise known as the weekend alternative, or in some places it's called the Baylor Plan, because Baylor was the first hospital to introduce that many years ago. There's also part-time staffing pool for people who are willing to work weekend shifts and holidays and specifically want to work those days. There's also the cyclical staffing, which allows you to be able to determine what your staffing is going to be for, say, 6 weeks out, and it's repeated in a particular pattern, like someone works every other weekend and they're off, say, a Thursday one week and a Tuesday the next week and then the weekend. There's also job sharing. You don't see a whole lot of that, but it is becoming more popular as two part-time nurses basically share one full-time position, and they, between them, cover the demands of that full-time position, and it can vary from one nurse working 2 12s a week and 3 the next, and one working 3 and then the 2, or even sometimes splitting a shift half. One does half and the other does the other half. And allowing nurses to exchange hours of work among themselves as long as it's covered, and it's covered with someone of equal qualification. You wouldn't switch your hours with a tech if you're a registered nurse, but that's another way of enticing flexibility and drawing employees who are interested in having that additional flexibility. And then there's flex time. Another use of scheduling options is providing supplemental staffing, maybe from internal float pools or from registries and external float pools like traveling nurses and whatnot. That's still very expensive. Most organizations don't utilize that unless it's an emergency, or they have an area that they simply don't have the staff qualified to cover it, and so they will use those outside sources. Internal float pools, some of the facilities now throughout their system will have an internal float pool where nurses agree to work in certain geographic areas, and they may be called to Hospital A one day and then Hospital B 2 or 3 days, and their shifts are not just on different units but at different facilities. And then shift bidding allows nurses to bid for what shifts they're going to work, as opposed to requiring that they do mandatory overtime, because mandatory overtime, while it might be a short-term strategy for dealing with staffing needs, it is not an ideal, and it can create an awful lot of resentment among staff, which can lead to turnover, which actually exacerbates the problem of their staffing shortage in an organization. Some scheduling alternatives involve agency nurses, travel nurses. Again, those are very expensive positions because you're not just paying for the hours that the nurse works, but you're paying an upcharge to the agency that has arranged them. Flex time, self-scheduling, float pools, all of these are considered scheduling alternatives. There's a lot of generational diversity in nursing, and while we embrace diversity and we talk a lot about diversity, it doesn't just bring positives, it can also bring some challenges to the equation. Right now in nursing we have 4 generations working, so it calls on all of us to be aware of what those different generations expect and what they value, and to recognize the differences so that we can utilize the strengths of each other, share our ideas, and provide the best care we can for our patients. There's a way for calculating nursing care hours per patient day, and basically you take the hours worked, all the hours worked in a 24-hour period, and you divide that by the patient's census. When we staff by acuity or using a patient classification system, sometimes they're called patient acuity systems, this is a way of grouping patients according to some specific characteristics, like they're all on ventilators, or they've all delivered babies in the last 24 hours. And then it looks at the hours of nursing care that are assigned for each patient classification, such as a level 1 patient might be someone who is really self-care, but they may be taking pain medicines, which requires the nurse to go in, or they're having dressing changes or something. And then every organization will have its specific and unique classification system that they use that works for the organization as a whole, and then typically there's some modified system on the different units, units with higher acuity, units that have a higher turnover, and units where the flexible or the census fluctuates fairly rapidly. It also requires an ongoing review, so that it is up to date with the most current number and acuity of patients. And there are a variety of internal and external forces that affect how a unit's classification system is used. Many years ago when these were first introduced, and the precursor to developing them was to do time studies, and they were very intensive and they required an awful lot of nursing man hours, which were not asked that they be done. Nurses were just told that they were going to do them. But the point was to assign or to identify how many times the nurse went into a room to do certain specific things for a patient, and how much time each one of those tasks took, whether it was giving a oral pain medicine, or it was giving a bath or a bed change, whatever that was. It looked at each task and the time involved, and then associated that with an acuity level for the patient. The critical indicator in a patient classification system are those things like bathing, diet, whether or not they have IV fluids or other fluids, other lines such as a Foley or a feeding tube, how many times they get medications, and how those care activities are categorized. And then the summative tasks, which requires the nurse to note the frequency of specific activities, like how many times the patient vomits, how many times they need pain medication, how many times they get a dressing change, and how many procedures a patient may have during that day, how many times they go off the unit or have someone come to the unit for blood draws, EKGs, x-rays, that sort of thing. And then at the national level, the use of patient care classification systems is a condition for participation in Medicare and Joint Commission certification. So while it may sound as though it's voluntary on the hospital part, it's only voluntary to the point at which one wants their institution to be eligible to receive Medicare and Medicaid funds and patients, and whether or not they want to be accredited by Joint Commission. And if a hospital is not accredited by Joint Commission, they're not going to be Medicare and Medicaid certified, and then you don't get paid. You essentially have a hospital that you can't get paid for taking care of much of anybody. Closed unit staffing is becoming a little bit more popular, and this happens when the staff on the unit make a commitment that they're going to cover all of the absences and expected and unexpected staffing needs among themselves, rather than be pulled from their unit when there's a low census. They'll still be kept on their unit. This can require some overtime and some unexpected plan changes for different nurses, but it does keep the accountability for covering the unit needs to the nurses who have a vested interest in that unit, and it does actually increase trust and team building if all the members live up to their commitments. What to do when you're handling understaffing issues? Well, the first thing is you don't stand around wasting a lot of time complaining about not having staff. You really need to say, okay, we're low on staff. Here's what we need to start doing while charge nurse, nurse manager, whoever starts getting on the phone and dealing with the powers that be in a university. Can we gather some more staff, calling in our own people, calling the internal float pool, whatever that looks like. But everyone standing around and complaining is clearly counterproductive to getting anything done. And it also makes nurses look less professional, more petty, and it just doesn't play well. All the decisions about understaffing need to meet state and federal labor laws and organizational policies. You can't require people to come in and work, their third shift, third 12-hour shift in a row, so that they're not endangering themselves or their patients because they're on an extended period of no sleep. Staff must also not be demoralized or excessively fatigued by the frequent and extended overtime requests. This can be a little bit difficult, especially when you have a closed unit. If there are a variety of unmet staffing needs, then it can actually deteriorate to where the same people are being called over and over, and on your day off, you don't even want to answer your phone because you think someone is going to call and ask you to come in. Long and short-term strategies need to be found to address understaffing issues. Hoping it'll go away is not an effective strategy, and organizations can't just turn a blind eye to it. They really do need to be actively involved in not only determining what is causing this chronic understaffing, but addressing retention, recruitment, and providing adequate staff. Whatever the staffing issues are and whatever strategies are used to address understaffing, patient care cannot be jeopardized, and patient safety cannot be jeopardized. So it is incumbent on the organization and the leadership to address those ongoing and chronic understaffing problems. Mandatory overtime, we don't hear quite so much about this anymore as we did for a few years, but this is where employees are forced to work additional shifts. And as nurses, what the threat was typically made to us was that if we refused, we were going to be reported for abandoning our patients. And since that's part of our responsibility as professionals, it's part of our expectations of our license, we can't abandon our patients, and that was kind of an unfair threat. If you haven't taken responsibility for your patient, or for a group of patients, you really can't be seen as abandoning them, and yet that was kind of used as a weapon. Mandatory overtime is not efficient, and it's not effective in the long run because it would imply that from a management and an organizational perspective that patient care really is not that important and adequate staffing is really not necessary, that staff can just kind of live with that. It's a strategy that's kind of built on hope that nothing goes wrong. In terms of staff perceptions, staff really don't like mandatory overtime. Most people don't really like to be told what they have to do, particularly when it infringes on their own personal time. They can feel like they have no control, and it can affect staff's attitude and mood, their motivation and productivity, and all of that can affect the quality and safety of patient care. When staff feel like they're being told to do something they don't want to do, and if this is a repeated thing in an organization, very often what staff do is go look for employment elsewhere, which exacerbates the problem that the organization is trying to address with mandatory overtime. Staffing and decision making. Remember, staffing, centralized and decentralized staffing is not the same thing as centralized and decentralized decision making. We learned about that in the decision making lecture. But there need to be fair and uniform staffing and scheduling policies, and those need to be communicated with the staff so that staff is aware what the expectations are as nurse managers when you're doing the interviewing process, and even in recruitment. Staffing needs to be discussed with potential employees so that they know what the expectations are in case it's not something that they're willing to participate in. Decentralized staffing and scheduling leads to more flexibility and autonomy, um, and staff tend to like it better. Managers tend to like it a little better. Um, but if just strictly speaking, centralized staffing is fairer to all employees because there is a more uniform policy um, adherence with that, and there's not this first come, first served, first whined, first answered kind of partiality that could exist in staffing that happens at the unit level. So connecting the key concepts. It's important to consider how staffing is linked to patient quality and patient safety, failure to rescue, how all of that has to do with risk, and what staffing has to do with recruitment and retention, and how it can be used to affect motivation on staff and as the budget as well. Also consider how staffing is linked to delegation and how that then is tied to failure to rescue. If you don't have a lot of staff, you end up having more delegation with less supervision, and then you can actually increase the risk to patient safety and increase the likelihood of failure to rescue. So staffing is very, very important in nursing. Think also about how mandatory overtime can actually undermine productivity. Nurses are coming in tired and angry. They're frustrated. They don't want to be there. That can undermine their trust in the organization. They can start cutting corners, which increases patients' risk. It can also create a lot of conflict, not just within the individual, but within the organization and on the unit.